Inside the courtroom, tension hung heavy, thickening the air as though the walls themselves bore witness to the brewing storm of injustice. At the center of it all stood a man in uniform, his arrogance palpable, his voice slicing through the silence like a razor. His sharp, condescending gaze carried a venomous disdain as he sneered. "You think you're above the law just because you wear that robe?" The room stiffened. Every eye turned to the bench, where Judge Malcolm Graves sat, calm, composed, a figure of unyielding dignity. But his composure was not merely professional. It was the armor of restraint, forged over years of enduring countless battles waged in silence. The judge met the officer's gaze unflinchingly, his measured silence a weapon in its own right, cutting through the charged atmosphere. "You forget your place," the judge said at last, his voice steady, firm, and laced with a quiet authority that demanded respect. The officer chuckled darkly, a laugh devoid of humor, designed to mock. Leaning forward with a sneer, he spat. "My place? My place is ensuring criminals like you don't use their power to hide." Gasps rippled through the room, a collective intake of breath as shock swept the audience. What followed wasn't just a verbal sparring match. It was an unprovoked assault, not of fists but of words. The officer launched into a tirade, laced with barely veiled racism, aimed at dismantling the judge's authority in front of all. His voice rose, sharp and venomous, his words a deliberate attempt to belittle. "Your kind doesn't belong here. You're just a man who got lucky in a broken system," he sneered. The insult hung in the air like a storm cloud, heavy and electric, daring someone to break the silence. Judge Graves sat unmoving, his hands gripping the edges of his bench, knuckles white. Beneath his calm exterior, a storm raged, a tempest of rage, humiliation, and bone-deep weariness born from a lifetime of enduring moments just like this. Yet he did not rise to the bait. His silence spoke volumes, unsettling even the officer, whose arrogance faltered under the weight of that unyielding quiet. Before the officer could continue, the judge leaned forward, his voice slicing through the charged air like tempered steel. "Are you finished humiliating yourself, officer? Or would you like to continue showing this courtroom exactly what kind of man you are?" The officer's face twisted in anger, but words failed him. The audience shifted uncomfortably, caught between the awkwardness of the moment and the palpable tension threatening to erupt. Every person in the room understood they were witnessing something extraordinary, something they would not soon forget. Still, the officer doubled down, unwilling to lose face. "Extraordinary," he barked, mocking the murmurs of the room. "What's extraordinary is how people like you get to sit in judgment over men like me." His voice grew louder, angrier, the blatant disrespect reverberating through the courtroom. Judge Graves betrayed no emotion, though his eyes gleamed with a quiet, dangerous fire, an unrelenting intensity that consumed but did not lash out. Turning calmly to the clerk, he instructed them to record every word the officer said. The judge's composure only inflamed the officer's frustration, his bravado cracking as desperation crept into his voice. "You think you can intimidate me? Your robe doesn't scare me," the officer snarled. "I've seen your kind my whole life, pretending to be better than the rest of us." The judge's response was swift and devastating. "And yet, here you are, standing in my courtroom, pleading for validation you'll never earn." The officer froze, his mouth opening and closing as if searching for words that wouldn't come. The room held its collective breath, the tension unbearable. And then it happened. A twist so shocking, so utterly unanticipated, that murmurs of disbelief rippled through the courtroom. Judge Graves, unervingly calm, began to unveil a truth poised to dismantle the officer's arrogant facade entirely. What was it? What secret had the judge kept, waiting for the precise moment to strike? The courtroom fell silent once more, every eye locked on the judge as he prepared to speak. Whatever came next would change everything. This story is one of resilience, justice, and a reckoning that will leave you questioning how justice is truly served. To our Black audience members, know that your voice and story matter. We stand with you against racism and discrimination, amplifying narratives that inspire strength, justice, and triumph. Stay tuned for a story that challenges prejudice and celebrates resilience. Navigating the unspoken biases that had once tried to block his path, Judge Malcolm Graves stood as a man shaped by struggle and perseverance. Born and raised in Birmingham, Alabama, during the waning years of the Civil Rights Movement, Malcolm knew the sting of discrimination early in life. His parents, both educators, instilled in him an unshakable belief in justice and the transformative power of resilience. Now in his early 50s, Malcolm had seen it all. His deep brown eyes carried the wisdom of a man who had weathered storms others could scarcely imagine, yet they retained a warmth that made even the most vulnerable in his courtroom feel seen and heard. He wore his robes like armor, a silent declaration that fairness and the rule of law would always guide him. His reputation was sterling. Known for his sharp intellect, unwavering fairness, and refusal to allow prejudice of any kind to influence his decisions, Malcolm Graves had become a symbol of integrity in the legal system. Across the aisle stood Officer Garrett Huxley, his polished badge gleaming under the harsh fluorescent lights. Garrett exuded confidence, but it teetered on the edge of arrogance. His crisp uniform and impeccable posture radiated authority, an authority he often wielded without restraint. A 15-year veteran of the force, Garrett had climbed the ranks with a swagger that came from knowing the benefit of the doubt was always on his side. Born into a family of law enforcement in suburban Atlanta, Garrett had been raised on tales of heroism and loyalty to the thin blue line. Yet, his approach to policing was divisive. While some colleagues admired his decisiveness, others whispered about his quick temper and questionable judgment. His record, though technically clean, bore the fingerprints of incidents quietly swept under the rug. A harsh word here, an unnecessary escalation there. To Garrett, these were insignificant blemishes, mere realities of a tough job in a chaotic world. Respect, he believed, was something to be demanded, not earned. The case that brought these two men together seemed unremarkable at first glance. A dispute over an arrest spiraled into allegations of excessive force. Garrett had detained a young black man for what he described as suspicious behavior, but the footage, now public, told a starkly different story. The trial had drawn a crowd, not just for the stakes it carried, but because it had become a flashpoint in a broader conversation about race, power, and accountability. To Garrett, this was just another day's work, a suspect who had stepped out of line. He saw himself as a protector, holding chaos at bay. But for Malcolm, this case represented something far deeper, a chance to challenge systemic inequalities that officers like Garrett often dismissed as exaggerations or excuses. The courtroom itself became a theater of contrasts. On one side, Malcolm's calm, measured demeanor exuded authority without bravado. On the other, Garrett's brash confidence bordered on defiance, his every gesture demanding control. The spectators watched intently, their faces a mosaic of emotions: hope, skepticism, quiet fury. Among them was a young journalist, clutching her notebook, eager to capture every moment. Beside her sat an older man with folded arms, his face lined with the marks of battles fought long before hashtags and viral videos. The atmosphere crackled with tension as the trial began. When Garrett took the stand, his testimony was precise, but laced with unspoken contempt. He painted a vivid picture of a dangerous world, where split-second decisions could mean life or death. He spoke of his years of service, the dangers he faced, and the sacrifices he made, framing himself as the unsung hero of an ungrateful society. Malcolm listened carefully, his expression unreadable. He had heard these justifications countless times before. While he didn't doubt the challenges of policing, he also knew that power unchecked was power abused. When the cross-examination began, Malcolm's questions were sharp, each one cutting through Garrett's carefully constructed narrative. He didn't raise his voice or show anger. Instead, he wielded logic and facts with surgical precision, exposing inconsistencies and dismantling assumptions. As the hours passed, it became clear that this was no longer just about one arrest or one officer. It was about the system itself, how it functioned, who it protected, and who it left behind. For Garrett, the scrutiny felt personal, an attack on his character, his choices, and his way of life. His responses grew defensive, his tone more hostile. The tension in the room thickened, laden with unspoken truths and simmering emotions. Outside the courthouse, the world buzzed with speculation. Protesters gathered on the courthouse steps, their chants a rhythmic echo of demands for justice. Reporters jostled for position, their cameras capturing every moment for the evening news. For Malcolm, this was familiar ground, the intersection of justice and spectacle, where the stakes were high and satisfaction was rare. But for Garrett, this was uncharted territory. He was used to being in control, dictating the terms. Now, the ground beneath him felt unsteady, and the cracks were beginning to show. The narrative had shifted, and Garrett Huxley felt the weight of it pressing down on him. For the first time, he was on the defensive, his authority questioned in a way that left him raw and exposed. He resented the probing questions, the relentless scrutiny, and above all, the man who sat across from him, Judge Malcolm Graves, unshaken and unbothered by Garrett's attempts to intimidate. As the day drew to a close, the courtroom emptied, leaving behind echoes of arguments and the heavy residue of unresolved tension. Garrett's jaw was set, his mind a storm of anger and thoughts of retribution. Meanwhile, Malcolm remained seated at his bench, hands clasped as though in prayer, his eyes distant yet resolute. The stage was set, the battle lines drawn, and the fight for justice had only just begun. The next morning, the air inside the courtroom was thick with anticipation. Spectators filed back into their seats, their conversations hushed but charged. The case had gained traction overnight. Whispers of the previous day's proceedings had spilled beyond the courthouse walls. Outside, the crowd of protesters had swelled, their chants for justice rising in unison with the hum of reporters delivering live updates to a rapt audience. Inside, however, the atmosphere was heavier, quieter, as though everyone present could feel the gravity of what was at stake. Judge Malcolm Graves entered the room, his black robe billowing slightly as he approached the bench. His expression was as measured as ever, but there was a sharper intensity in his gaze, a silent signal that he was prepared to see this through. His eyes briefly scanned the courtroom before settling on Garrett Huxley, seated at the defense table beside his lawyer. Garrett appeared composed, but the tension in his clenched jaw and the nervous flicker of his gaze toward the spectators betrayed him. He was acutely aware of the eyes watching, judging, waiting. The proceedings began with the prosecution calling their key witness, Jordan, a young black man at the center of the arrest that had sparked the case. Jordan's voice trembled slightly as he recounted the events of that night, but his determination steadied him. He described walking home after a long shift at work, the confusion of being stopped without cause, and the fear that consumed him as the situation escalated. His words painted a vivid and harrowing picture, pulling the courtroom into his experience. Then came Garrett's lawyer, Alan Rose, a sharp-tongued advocate with a reputation for ruthless cross-examinations. Alan's questions were pointed, each one carefully designed to chip away at Jordan's credibility. His tone was calm yet calculated, leaving no room for emotion. Malcolm observed the exchange with quiet intensity, his fingers tapping lightly on the bench, a subtle sign of his growing unease. When Garrett took the stand again, his demeanor had shifted. He spoke with forced confidence, his voice firm but betraying a slight strain. He described the arrest through his own lens, portraying Jordan as uncooperative and combative. Garrett emphasized his years of experience, his rigorous training, and his commitment to protecting the community. But beneath his carefully chosen words and rehearsed tone lay a current of frustration he couldn't fully conceal. Malcolm leaned forward, his hands folded on the bench, his voice steady yet commanding. "Officer Huxley," he began, "let's revisit the footage of the arrest." The clerk nodded and played the video. The grainy footage filled the courtroom, pulling everyone into the moment. On the screen, Jordan stood on the sidewalk, his hands raised in confusion as Garrett approached him with aggression. The video showed no resistance from Jordan, only his repeated attempts to ask why he was being detained. The room sat in tense silence, each second of the video dragging like an eternity. When it ended, Malcolm turned to Garrett, his voice calm but carrying a sharp edge that sliced through the thick air. "Officer Huxley," he said, Would you care to explain the discrepancy between your testimony and what we've just seen? Garrett hesitated, his composure cracking for the first time. He stammered, grasping for words that wouldn't come. Before he could fully respond, Alan rose to object, claiming the question was leading. But it was too late. The courtroom had seen the truth, laid bare and undeniable. No legal maneuvering could erase what had just unfolded. As the day progressed, the tension in the courtroom only deepened. Witness after witness took the stand, each adding a new layer to the unfolding story. Some testified to Garrett Huxley's history on the force, detailing his aggressive tactics and his troubling reputation for targeting certain communities. Others spoke of Judge Malcolm Graves, praising his unwavering commitment to justice and the steady hand with which he wielded his authority. Every testimony fueled the fire, turning the courtroom into a crucible of clashing truths and unspoken emotions. During a brief recess, Malcolm retreated to his chambers. He sat at his desk, his hands clasped tightly in front of him, his mind racing. He thought about Jordan, the young man whose life had been upended. He thought about Garrett and the system that had allowed this moment to exist. His thoughts turned inward, to his own journey, the obstacles he'd overcome, and the battles he'd fought to occupy this very seat of power. The weight of the gavel resting on his desk felt heavier than ever, a symbol of the immense responsibility he bore. When the trial resumed, Malcolm returned to the bench with a renewed resolve. His demeanor was steady, his focus razor-sharp as the closing arguments began. The prosecutor's words cut through the tension like a scalpel, painting a damning picture of systemic failure and unchecked power. She highlighted the footage of the arrest, the testimony of witnesses, and the undeniable pattern of behavior that had emerged. Her argument was precise, deliberate, and unyielding. Alan Rose, Garrett's defense attorney, countered with polished rhetoric, but his words felt hollow in comparison. His attempts to deflect blame grew increasingly desperate, each argument landing with less conviction than the last. Garrett sat rigidly at the defense table, his fists clenched beneath the polished wood. His confidence, once unshakable, now seemed to waver under the weight of the evidence against him. As the prosecutor concluded, Malcolm addressed the courtroom. His tone was firm, yet deliberate, his words carrying the full weight of his authority. This case, he began, is not just about one incident. It is about accountability. It is about the standards we hold ourselves to as a society and the kind of justice we seek to uphold. The room fell silent as his words sank in, pressing down on everyone present. Garrett's face remained a mask of defiance, but his eyes betrayed a flicker of doubt, a crack in the armor he had worked so hard to construct. The tension in the room reached its zenith, a powder keg of emotions waiting to ignite. Spectators filed out of the courtroom at the day's end, their faces etched with anger, hope, and exhaustion. The question lingered, heavy in the air. What would happen next? Later, in the quiet of his chambers, Malcolm sat alone. The gavel lay before him on the desk, a silent reminder of the decisions that lay ahead. The courthouse around him buzzed with restless energy, but inside his office, there was only silence. Malcolm's mind was consumed by the day's events and the storm brewing outside, one that he knew would change everything. When the court reconvened after the final recess, the atmosphere was electric, charged with restless energy. Malcolm took his seat, his hands resting lightly on the gavel. His face was calm, yet his eyes carried an intensity that suggested he knew this day would not end as it began. Across the room, Garrett sat at the defense table, his jaw clenched and his eyes darting nervously between the spectators and the judge. His lawyer whispered something in his ear, but Garrett barely acknowledged it, his thoughts elsewhere. The prosecutor began her closing statement, her voice sharp and deliberate. She painted a vivid picture of systemic failure, emphasizing the damning footage and the testimony that had exposed Garrett's troubling pattern of behavior. Garrett shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his confidence visibly eroding as the weight of her argument bore down on him. When it was Garrett's turn to speak, he hesitated before standing. The bravado he'd displayed earlier was gone, replaced by a forced calmness that barely concealed the turmoil beneath. His voice, though steady, lacked conviction as he spoke about the challenges of being a police officer, the dangers of the job, and the split-second decisions that could mean life or death. He avoided addressing the footage directly, instead framing himself as a victim of public opinion and media bias. The courtroom was silent as Garrett spoke, the audience hanging on his every word. But unease lingered in the air. His words rang hollow, failing to match the gravity of what had been shown and heard over the past days. Garrett glanced at Malcolm, his eyes narrowing slightly as he added a subtle jab about working under the scrutiny of people who had never worn a badge. Malcolm's expression remained unreadable, but his eyes darkened briefly, a flicker of something unspoken passing across his face. When Garrett returned to his seat, the room collectively exhaled, the tension shifting as all eyes turned back to Malcolm. He waited a moment before speaking, his voice calm but weighted with authority. "This courtroom," he said, his words deliberate, "is not a place for excuses. It is a place for accountability, for truth, and for justice." He turned his gaze to Garrett. "Officer Huxley, the footage we've seen and the testimonies we've heard paint a troubling picture, not just of one incident, but of a pattern of behavior that undermines the very principles you claim to uphold." Alan rose to object, but Malcolm raised a hand, silencing him with a single gesture. "I have allowed this trial to proceed fairly, giving you every opportunity to present your case. But the facts remain, and they cannot be ignored." He paused, his words hanging heavy in the air. "I have spent my life in pursuit of justice, not just as a judge, but as a man who has seen the impact of injustice firsthand. This case is not just about the actions of one officer. It is about the broader implications of those actions, the harm they cause, the trust they erode, and the lives they destroy." The courtroom was silent, the weight of his words settling over everyone present. Outside, the crowd surged, their chants for justice echoing into the evening air. Inside, the storm was far from over, but the first cracks in the facade had begun to appear. Garrett's face hardened, his jaw clenching as he stared at the judge. "You don't know anything about me," he said, his voice low but charged with anger. "You sit up there in your robe, pretending to be better than everyone else, but you don't understand what it's like out there. You don't understand what it takes to do my job." Malcolm leaned forward slightly, his eyes locking onto Garrett's with an intensity that made the room hold its breath. "You're right, Officer Huxley," he began, his voice calm but firm. "I don't know what it's like to walk in your shoes, but I do know what it's like to walk in Jordan's shoes. I know what it's like to be stopped, questioned, and judged, not for what I've done, but for who I am. And that is why I sit here, not to pretend to be better, but to ensure that justice is not determined by the biases of those who wield power." Garrett's face flushed with anger, his composure slipping further. "This isn't about justice," he snapped. "This is about you trying to make a point, trying to prove something at my expense." Malcolm's voice remained steady, but his eyes burned with a fire that couldn't be ignored. "The only point I am making," he said, "is that accountability is not optional, Officer Huxley. It is the foundation of the law, the very reason this courtroom exists. And no one, not you, not me, is above it." The room was silent, the weight of Malcolm's words pressing down on everyone present. Garrett's lawyer shifted uncomfortably, his hands clasped tightly in front of him as he leaned in to whisper something to his client. But Garrett didn't respond, his eyes fixed on Malcolm with a mixture of defiance and unease. Malcolm leaned back in his chair, his gaze sweeping over the courtroom. "This case," he continued, "has brought to light issues that go far beyond one arrest, one officer, or one judge. It has revealed the fractures in our system, the biases that persist, and the harm they cause. It is up to us, all of us, to confront these issues head-on, to demand better, and to hold each other accountable." As he spoke, his voice softened, but the power behind it did not waver. "This is not just about the past. It is about the future we want to build, the legacy we want to leave behind. And that future begins with the decisions we make here and now." The room remained still, the silence deafening as Malcolm's words sank in. Garrett's face was a storm of conflicting emotions, his usual confidence shattered under the weight of what had been said. The audience watched intently, their faces reflecting a mix of hope, anger, and anticipation. Everyone in the room knew that the next moments would define everything. Malcolm glanced down at the gavel resting on his bench, his hand hovering over it as though it carried the weight of the world. Then he looked back at Garrett, their eyes meeting one last time. Justice, Malcolm said, his voice resolute, is not about power. It is about accountability. And it is time for you, Officer Huxley, to face it. The courtroom froze in time, the weight of Malcolm's words hanging in the air like a storm cloud. Every pair of eyes was fixed on him, every breath held in anticipation of what would follow. Garrett sat motionless at the defense table, his fingers gripping the edge so tightly his knuckles turned white. His lawyer leaned in, whispering something urgent, but Garrett didn't respond. His gaze remained locked on Malcolm, defiance and unease etched into his face. Malcolm's voice broke the silence, calm but piercing. Officer Huxley, you've spoken about the challenges of your job, the split-second decisions, the dangers you face every day. These are real, undeniable truths, and I do not dismiss them. But what you fail to acknowledge, what you refuse to acknowledge, is the damage caused when those decisions are rooted not in necessity, but in prejudice. Garrett blinked, snapping out of his trance. His voice rose with indignation. Prejudice? You don't know what you're talking about. I do my job, and I do it well. I don't have time to worry about who someone is or where they come from when I'm trying to protect the people in this city. Malcolm's gaze remained steady, his tone unshakable. Protecting the people in this city includes those who look like Jordan, those who walk these streets carrying the burden of assumptions made about them before they even speak. Do you understand the harm you've done, Officer Huxley? Do you understand the fear you've instilled in the very people you claim to protect? Garrett's frustration boiled over, and he stood abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. You don't know what it's like out there, he shouted. You sit up here in your robe, passing judgment, but you've never had to make the kind of choices I make every single day. Malcolm didn't flinch. His voice, sharp as a scalpel, cut through Garrett's outburst. And yet, here we are, Officer Huxley, because of the choices you've made. Choices that have brought us to this moment, where the consequences of your actions can no longer be ignored. Garrett's lawyer stood, his voice raised in objection. Your Honor, this line of commentary is inflammatory and irrelevant to the case at hand. Malcolm turned his gaze to the lawyer, his expression impassive. On the contrary, Counselor, it is entirely relevant. This courtroom exists to examine not only actions, but the intent behind them, the patterns they reveal, and the impact they leave behind. The lawyer opened his mouth to respond, but Malcolm raised a hand, silencing him. This is not a debate, Counselor. Sit down. The lawyer reluctantly obeyed, his jaw tight with frustration. Garrett, however, remained standing, his chest heaving with barely contained anger. You want to talk about consequences? He demanded, his voice trembling with rage. Fine. Let's talk about them. Let's talk about the criminals I've taken off the streets, the families I've protected, the lives I've saved. What have you done, Judge Graves, besides sit in that chair and pretend you're better than the rest of us? Malcolm's eyes narrowed, the fire in them unmistakable. What I've done, Officer Huxley, is dedicate my life to ensuring that justice is applied fairly, that those who wield power are held accountable, and that the people who walk into this courtroom leave knowing they were heard. That is what I've done. Garrett's laugh was sharp and bitter, slicing through the tense silence. Fairly? Don't make me laugh. You think this trial is fair? You think I'm sitting here because of what I've done? No. I'm here because of who I am, because I wear this uniform, because I enforce the law. Malcolm's voice dropped low and steady, each word deliberate and unwavering. You are here, Officer Huxley, because of the choices you've made, because of the harm those choices have caused, and because no one, not even someone in uniform, is above the law. Garrett's defiance faltered for a moment, a flicker of doubt crossing his face before he masked it with a sneer. You talk a lot about the law, Judge Graves. But let's be honest, the law is just words on a page. What matters is who has the power to enforce it. Malcolm leaned forward slightly, his hands clasped on the bench. His voice, steady and piercing, cut through the thick tension in the room. And that is precisely why you are here. Because power without accountability is not justice, it is tyranny. The room was deathly silent, the tension almost unbearable. Garrett's face was a storm of emotions, anger, frustration, fear, all warring for control. He opened his mouth to speak, but Malcolm continued, his voice rising slightly with conviction. This case is not just about you, Officer Huxley. It is about the people you have harmed, the trust you have betrayed, and the system you represent. It is about ensuring that the law applies equally to everyone, regardless of their title, their status, or their uniform. Garrett's shoulders slumped slightly, the fight draining out of him as the weight of Malcolm's words bore down on him. His lawyer placed a hand on his arm, whispering something urgently, but Garrett didn't respond. He sank back into his chair, his head bowed, his confidence shattered. Malcolm straightened in his seat, his gaze sweeping over the courtroom. "This is not an easy case," he said, his tone calm but firm. "It is not an easy conversation, but it is a necessary one. Because if we are to move forward as a society, we must confront the truths we would rather ignore, and we must hold ourselves, and each other, to the highest standards of justice." The silence that followed was deafening, the room holding its collective breath as the gravity of Malcolm's words settled over them. Garrett sat motionless, his hands clenched tightly in his lap, his face pale. The spectators watched intently, their expressions a mixture of hope, anger, and anticipation. Malcolm's voice broke the silence one last time, quiet but resolute. "Justice is not just a word. It is a principle. It is a responsibility. And it is what this court will uphold." The gavel fell, the sound echoing through the room like a thunderclap. The courtroom remained in stunned silence long after the sound of the gavel faded. For a moment, it felt as though time itself had stopped, the weight of the decision pressing heavily on everyone present. Malcolm Graves remained seated at the bench, his hands resting on the polished wood, his face a mask of composure. Inside, however, he felt the familiar heaviness of responsibility settle over him. This was not a moment of triumph. It never was. Justice, he knew, was rarely clean or simple. It was a relentless pursuit, often messy and imperfect, and the consequences were not always easy to reconcile. Officer Garrett Huxley sat at the defense table, his face pale, his posture slouched. His lawyer was speaking to him in hushed tones, but Garrett didn't seem to hear a word. His hands rested limply on the table, his fingers twitching slightly, as though grasping for something intangible. For the first time, the confident, self-assured man who had walked into the courtroom days ago seemed entirely diminished. His bravado had been stripped away. His eyes darted to the faces in the gallery, searching for something. Sympathy, perhaps, or validation, but finding only blank stares or thinly veiled contempt. The spectators began to stir, the initial shock giving way to murmurs that rippled through the room. Conversations buzzed quietly, the words indistinct but carrying a palpable mix of emotions. Some were relieved. Others were visibly angry, their expressions betraying the weight of their own experiences with a system that had failed them before. A young woman near the front wiped at her eyes, her hands trembling slightly as she held on to a notebook. Beside her, an older man leaned back in his seat, his arms crossed tightly over his chest, his jaw set in grim satisfaction. Malcolm rose slowly, his movements deliberate, and the room fell silent once more. His voice, when he spoke, was calm but resolute. This court's decision is not the end of the conversation. It is a step, one among many, toward addressing the challenges we face as a society. Justice demands accountability, Malcolm began, his voice steady yet burdened with weight, but it also demands that we examine ourselves, our systems and the biases that shape them. He paused, his gaze sweeping the room, taking in the diverse faces before him. What we do next matters, not just in this courtroom but beyond it. The choices we make, the conversations we have, the actions we take, they will determine whether this moment becomes a turning point or just another instance of fleeting resolve. The room remained still, the gravity of his words pressing down on everyone gathered. Malcolm's gaze lingered for a moment longer before he turned and stepped away from the bench, disappearing into his chambers. He left the courtroom to process the aftermath on its own. The gallery began to empty slowly, people filing out into the bright, chaotic world outside. Protesters' chants grew louder, their voices reverberating against the courthouse walls. Reporters swarmed the steps, clamoring for interviews, their cameras aimed at anyone willing to speak. Garrett exited through a side door, flanked by his lawyer and a handful of officers. His steps were quick, almost frantic, as though he could outrun the judgment that had been cast upon him. The media descended upon him, their questions sharp and relentless. But Garrett kept his head down, his face a blank mask. His lawyer shielded him as best as he could, but the weight of the public's gaze was inescapable. Inside, Garrett's mind was a storm of anger, shame, and disbelief. He had never imagined this day would come, that he would find himself on the other side of the system he had served so long. In his chambers, Malcolm sat at his desk, the door closed behind him. The room was quiet, the muffled noise from outside a distant hum. He leaned back in his chair, hands clasped in his lap, his thoughts replaying the trial. He thought of Jordan, the courage it had taken for him to testify, to stand up against someone who had once held power over him. He thought of Garrett, the arrogance that had shielded him from accountability for so long. And he thought of the system itself, the countless Jordans and Garretts caught in its web, their lives shaped by forces beyond their control. A knock at the door broke his reverie. His clerk entered, a stack of papers in hand. She hesitated before speaking. "Your Honor," she said softly, "there's a group outside asking to speak with you. Community leaders. Activists. They want to thank you." Malcolm nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful. "Tell them I'll join them shortly," he replied, his voice quiet but resolute. The clerk left, leaving him alone once more. Outside, the crowd had swelled. Some celebrated, their voices jubilant. Others remained solemn, their faces marked by anger or quiet determination. Garrett's departure had only fueled the tension, widening the divide between those who saw justice in the verdict and those who felt betrayed. Amid the chaos, a small group of community leaders stood together, their presence a calm force in the sea of emotion. When Malcolm finally emerged, the crowd turned their attention to him. The noise quieted as he approached. He stood before them, his black robes billowing slightly in the breeze, his expression steady but weary. One of the leaders, a woman with silver-streaked hair and a commanding presence, stepped forward. "Thank you," she said simply, her voice carrying the weight of decades of advocacy and struggle. Malcolm met her gaze, his eyes reflecting both gratitude and resolve. "It's not enough," he said, his voice low but firm. "There is still so much to be done." The woman nodded, her expression softening slightly. "But it's a start," she replied. "And sometimes, that's all we can ask for." Slowly, the crowd began to disperse, the energy shifting once more as people returned to their lives, carrying with them the weight of what they had witnessed. For Malcolm, the day was far from over. The trial had ended, but the work of justice was ongoing. A relentless pursuit that demanded vigilance, courage, and an unyielding commitment to truth. The courthouse had emptied, yet the air still carried the echoes of what had unfolded that day. Alone in his chambers, Malcolm sat at his desk, the gavel resting in front of him. The quiet hum of the building was a stark contrast to the cacophony outside, where protesters continued their chants and reporters scrambled for fresh angles. But even in the quiet, Malcolm found no solace. He leaned back in his chair, his gaze fixed on the ceiling, replaying the tidal wave of emotions he had worked so hard to suppress throughout the trial. A knock at the door jolted him from his thoughts. Before he could respond, the door opened slightly, and Jordan stepped inside. His movements were hesitant, his face a mixture of uncertainty and relief. Malcolm straightened, gesturing for him to enter. Jordan hesitated for a moment, then stepped forward, his hands shoved deep into his jacket pockets. "Judge Graves," Jordan began, his voice quieter than it had been in the courtroom. I wanted to thank you. For today. For everything." Malcolm gestured to the chair across from his desk. Jordan sat down slowly, his eyes darting around the room as though he wasn't sure he belonged there. Malcolm leaned forward, resting his elbows on the desk, his expression softening. "You don't owe me any thanks, Jordan," he said, his tone firm yet kind. "You owe yourself thanks. It was your courage, your willingness to stand up and speak the truth, that made the difference today." Jordan shifted in his seat, his gaze dropping to his hands. "It didn't feel like courage," he admitted. "It felt like I was just trying to survive." Malcolm nodded, his eyes filled with understanding. "Sometimes surviving is the bravest thing we can do," he said gently. "And speaking the truth in a world that tries to silence you, that takes more strength than most people will ever realize." Jordan looked up, meeting Malcolm's gaze for the first time since he'd entered the room. "Do you think it'll really change anything?" he asked, his voice a mix of hope and doubt. "I mean, what happens next? Will it even matter?" Malcolm's expression grew heavier, as though he carried the weight of the question along with his own doubts. "Change is never immediate," he said, "and it's never easy. But it starts with moments like this, with people like you standing up and demanding it. It's a long road, Jordan, but every step matters." Jordan nodded, his shoulders relaxing slightly. For the first time, he allowed himself to breathe, releasing the tension that had gripped him for so long. "It's just hard," he said, his voice quieter. "Knowing there are so many people like him out there, people who don't see us as equals, people who think they can do whatever they want because they'll never be held accountable." Malcolm's voice softened, but it lost none of its conviction. "That's why we fight. That's why we hold them accountable when we can. Because every time we do, we remind them, and the world, that justice isn't just a word. It's a promise." The two men sat in silence for a moment, the gravity of the conversation settling between them. Finally, Jordan stood, his movements slow but steady. "Thank you, Judge Graves," he said again, his voice stronger this time, "for believing me, for seeing me." Malcolm rose as well, extending a hand. Jordan hesitated for only a moment before taking it. The handshake was firm, steady. "You deserve to be seen, Jordan," Malcolm said quietly. "And don't ever let anyone convince you otherwise." Jordan left the room. The weight on his shoulders lightened, though not gone. Alone again, Malcolm sank back into his chair, his thoughts swirling. He knew Jordan's journey was far from over, and he knew the road ahead for Garrett Huxley would be filled with consequences he couldn't yet comprehend. In a quiet corner of the courthouse, Garrett sat alone. His lawyer had stepped away to make a phone call, leaving him in the sterile silence of the waiting area. The fluorescent lights cast a harsh glow on his face, accentuating the deep lines of tension etched into his features. His hands were clasped tightly in his lap, his fingers digging into his palms as though trying to anchor himself. The door opened, and a fellow officer stepped inside. Garrett looked up, his expression a mixture of relief and frustration. "Miller," he said, his voice hoarse. "You've got no idea what kind of day I've had." Officer Miller leaned against the wall, arms crossed, studying Garrett with an unreadable expression. There was a tension in his posture that Garrett either didn't notice or chose to ignore. "I've been watching the news," Miller said after a long pause. "Looks like things didn't go your way," Garrett scoffed, leaning back in his chair. "That's an understatement," he muttered bitterly. "Graves had it out for me from the start. This whole thing was a setup." Miller's eyes narrowed slightly. "You really believe that?" he asked, his voice calm but edged with sharpness. "You think this was about Graves? Or do you think maybe, just maybe, you brought this on yourself?" Garrett's head snapped up, his eyes narrowing in disbelief. "What the hell is that supposed to mean?" he demanded. "You're supposed to have my back." Miller shrugged, his expression impassive. "I've got your back when you're doing your job. But this? Garrett, this isn't the job. This is you thinking you're untouchable. And now you're paying the price." Garrett's face flushed with anger, his fists clenching. "You don't know what you're talking about," he snapped. "You weren't there. You don't know what it's like." Miller's voice remained calm, but the quiet frustration in it cut deeper than any shouted words could. "You're right. I wasn't there. But I've seen the footage. I've heard the testimony. And I know that if we don't start holding ourselves accountable, no one else will." The words hung in the air, heavy and unrelenting. Garrett stared at Miller, his anger slowly giving way to something else, something he didn't want to name, something he couldn't face. Finally, he looked away, his shoulders slumping under the weight of everything. Miller sighed, pushing off the wall. As he headed for the door, he turned back one last time, his expression softer but no less firm. "You've got a lot to think about, Garrett. I hope you do." The door closed behind him, leaving Garrett alone. The silence pressed down on him like a physical weight. For the first time, he found himself questioning, not just the trial but everything that had led him to this moment. And for the first time, he wasn't sure he liked the answers. The day stretched into early evening, the courthouse now almost deserted. Its grand halls, once filled with voices and footsteps, had fallen silent, save for the faint echoes of a distant janitor's cart. Garrett Huxley sat alone in an empty conference room, his head resting heavily in his hands. The hum of fluorescent lights filled the oppressive quiet, their harsh glow making the room feel impossibly small. His lawyer had stepped out for what felt like the 100th phone call, leaving Garrett alone with nothing but his thoughts and the judgment that weighed on him like an anchor. He hadn't spoken since the trial ended, his mind a chaotic storm of anger, shame, and disbelief. The door opened abruptly, the sound startling Garrett out of his haze. He looked up to see his father standing in the doorway. The older man's presence filled the room instantly, his sharp, square jaw and piercing eyes a mirror of Garrett's own. Dressed in his worn police uniform, the elder Huxley carried the weight of decades of service, a man who had spent his life enforcing the law and expected his son to follow the same unwavering path. Garrett straightened in his chair, his face hardening instinctively. "Dad," he said flatly, his voice devoid of its usual confidence. "I didn't think you'd come." His father closed the door behind him, crossing his arms as he leaned against it. "I wasn't going to," he admitted, his tone gruff. "But then I saw the news." Garrett's jaw tightened, frustration bubbling to the surface. "So, you're here to rub it in? Tell me how I've disgraced the family name." His father's expression didn't change. His voice remained steady, but every word was heavy with meaning. "No, I'm here because you need to hear the truth. And you're not going to like it." Garrett scoffed bitterly, the sound sharp and cutting. "The truth? Spare me, Dad. I've had enough lectures for one day." But his father didn't move, his eyes boring into Garrett's. "You think this is about a lecture? You think I'm here to scold you like a child?" He shook his head, his voice sharpening. "No, Garrett. I'm here because what you've done isn't just a mistake. It's a stain. On you, on this uniform, on everything I taught you." Garrett shot to his feet, the chair scraping loudly against the tiled floor. "What you taught me," he snapped. "You mean how to do my job? How to keep order? How to make sure these streets are safe?" His father's voice rose for the first time, slicing through Garrett's defensive outburst like a blade. "What I taught you was to respect the badge, to respect the people you swore to protect. But you've forgotten that, haven't you? You've let your pride and your prejudice get in the way of everything that badge is supposed to stand for." Garrett's fists clenched at his sides, his face reddening as he struggled to contain his anger. "You weren't there," he spat. "You didn't see what I saw. You don't know what it's like out there." His father took a step closer, his voice quieter now but no less sharp. "You're right, I wasn't there. But I've been out there, Garrett, longer than you've been alive. I know what it's like to face danger, to make tough calls. But I also know what it's like to let that power go to your head. And that's exactly what you've done." The words hit Garrett like a punch to the gut. His breath hitched, and for a moment, he looked away, unable to meet his father's gaze. The room fell silent, the tension between father and son crackling like a live wire. Finally, Garrett sank back into his chair, his shoulders slumping as the fight drained out of him. "I didn't mean for it to go this far," he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. I thought I was doing the right thing, protecting people, following the rules." His father's expression softened slightly, but his tone remained firm. "The rules are there to protect everyone, Garrett, not just the people you think deserve it. If you can't see that, then you have no business wearing that uniform." Garrett looked up, his eyes filled with a mixture of anger and despair. "So what am I supposed to do now? Just give up? Let them take everything I've worked for? His father sighed heavily, shaking his head. No one's asking you to give up, but you need to own up to what you've done. You need to make it right. Because if you don't, this is going to haunt you for the rest of your life. Garrett stared at his father, his mind racing with conflicting emotions. He wanted to argue, to push back, to defend himself. But deep down, he knew his father was right. He had crossed a line, and now he had to face the consequences. Before he could respond, the door opened again. His lawyer stepped inside, his face tense. "Garrett," he said, his voice clipped. "We need to talk." Garrett's father stepped aside, his gaze lingering on his son for a moment before turning to leave. As he reached the door, he paused, looking back over his shoulder. "You've got a choice to make, Garrett," he said quietly. "And it's not just about you. It's about the kind of man you want to be." The door closed behind him, leaving Garrett alone with his lawyer. The silence that followed was deafening, the weight of his father's words pressing down on him like a physical force. "What is it?" Garrett asked finally, his voice hollow. The lawyer hesitated, his expression unreadable. "The DA's office is considering additional charges," he said. "If they go through with it, things are going to get a lot worse." Garrett's stomach dropped, his mind spinning as he tried to process the news. "What kind of charges?" he asked, his voice tinged with desperation. The lawyer sighed, pulling out a folder and setting it on the table. "They're looking into your past cases, complaints, allegations, things that were brushed under the rug." Garrett's heart sank as he realized what this meant. The cracks in his armor were widening, and there was no way to hold them together. He buried his face in his hands, the weight of his actions crashing down on him in full force. For the first time, he felt truly powerless, and he hated it. The courthouse, once brimming with energy and tension, had finally fallen silent. The echoes of the trial no longer reverberated in its grand chambers, yet the weight of what had transpired lingered in the air. Judge Malcolm Graves remained seated in his chambers, the heavy gavel resting untouched on his desk, a symbol of the judgment he had delivered and the responsibility he carried. Though the world outside had begun to move on, Malcolm sat in quiet reflection. The events of the trial played on a loop in his mind. The words, the faces, the emotions, a collage of moments that could not be ignored. The verdict was not an end but a chapter in a much larger, ongoing story. Malcolm knew this. He always had. Jordan, the young man who had stood at the heart of the case, had finally returned home. The familiar streets of his neighborhood greeted him, lined with the faces of family, friends, and neighbors who embraced him with a mixture of pride and empathy. Jordan felt the burden he had carried begin to ease, though it had not disappeared entirely. For him, the trial had been more than a fight for justice. It had been a fight to reclaim his identity, his voice, and his dignity. As he sat on the worn steps of his porch, gazing at the fading light of the setting sun, he was overwhelmed by a sense of relief but also uncertainty. He had faced his fears, spoken his truth, and played a pivotal role in the trial. Yet, he knew this was only the beginning. The world hadn't changed overnight, and the challenges ahead loomed large. Still, he felt a small but growing spark of hope. For Garrett Huxley, the once confident officer at the center of the case, the world looked very different. His resignation from the police force had been swift and unceremonious, a quiet admission of defeat buried beneath layers of procedural bureaucracy. There were no headlines marking his departure, no statements of remorse or vindication. Garrett's uniform now hung unused in his closet, a relic of the life he had once lived, a life that had revolved around authority, power, and an unwavering belief in his own righteousness. In the days following the trial, Garrett found himself adrift. His colleagues, once his allies, had grown distant. The camaraderie he had taken for granted evaporated, leaving him isolated and uncertain. For the first time, Garrett was forced to confront not only the consequences of his actions, but also the deeply ingrained biases and behaviors that had led him to this point. He felt a gnawing emptiness, a sense of loss that he couldn't articulate, and he struggled to find a way forward. Malcolm, meanwhile, returned to the courtroom the following week, his demeanor as composed and steady as ever. Yet something had shifted. The trial had sparked something in the community, a movement that could not be ignored. The courthouse, once a place of routine judgments and quiet bureaucracy, became a focal point for change. Malcolm found his docket filled with new cases brought forward by people who, inspired by Jordan's courage, had decided to speak up. The stories were as diverse as the people telling them, yet they shared common threads: injustice, marginalization, and a yearning to be heard. Malcolm approached each case with the same careful deliberation he always had, but now his rulings carried a different weight. They were not just judgments. They were statements, signals to the community that accountability mattered and that justice was a principle to be upheld, not a privilege to be bestowed. Jordan's life took a new trajectory in the months that followed. The experience of the trial had left an indelible mark on him, shaping his sense of purpose. He enrolled in college, determined to study law, not out of admiration for the system, but out of a deep desire to change it. Garrett's father stepped aside, his gaze lingering on his son for a moment before turning to leave. As he reached the door, he paused, looking back over his shoulder. "You've got a choice to make, Garrett," he said quietly. "And it's not just about you. It's about the kind of man you want to be." The door closed behind him, leaving Garrett alone with his lawyer. The silence that followed was deafening, the weight of his father's words pressing down on him like a physical force. "What is it?" Garrett asked finally, his voice hollow. The lawyer hesitated, his expression unreadable. "The DA's office is considering additional charges," he said. "If they go through with it, things are going to get a lot worse." Garrett's stomach dropped, his mind spinning as he tried to process the news. "What kind of charges?" he asked, his voice tinged with desperation. The lawyer sighed, pulling out a folder and setting it on the table. "They're looking into your past cases, complaints, allegations, things that were brushed under the rug." Garrett's heart sank as he realized what this meant. The cracks in his armor were widening, and there was no way to hold them together. He buried his face in his hands, the weight of his actions crashing down on him in full force. For the first time, he felt truly powerless, and he hated it. The courthouse, once brimming with energy and tension, had finally fallen silent. The echoes of the trial no longer reverberated in its grand chambers, yet the weight of what had transpired lingered in the air. Judge Malcolm Graves remained seated in his chambers, the heavy gavel resting untouched on his desk, a symbol of the judgment he had delivered and the responsibility he carried. Though the world outside had begun to move on, Malcolm sat in quiet reflection. The events of the trial played on a loop in his mind. The words, the faces, the emotions, a collage of moments that could not be ignored. The verdict was not an end but a chapter in a much larger, ongoing story. Malcolm knew this. He always had. Jordan, the young man who had stood at the heart of the case, had finally returned home. The familiar streets of his neighborhood greeted him, lined with the faces of family, friends, and neighbors who embraced him with a mixture of pride and empathy. Jordan felt the burden he had carried begin to ease, though it had not disappeared entirely. For him, the trial had been more than a fight for justice. It had been a fight to reclaim his identity, his voice, and his dignity. As he sat on the worn steps of his porch, gazing at the fading light of the setting sun, he was overwhelmed by a sense of relief but also uncertainty. He had faced his fears, spoken his truth, and played a pivotal role in the trial. Yet, he knew this was only the beginning. The world hadn't changed overnight, and the challenges ahead loomed large. Still, he felt a small but growing spark of hope. Jordan wanted to become an advocate, a defender of those who, like him, had felt powerless in the face of authority. He threw himself into his studies with a fervor that surprised even him, fueled by the memory of the trial and the knowledge that his voice could make a difference. Jordan's journey was far from easy, but each challenge he faced only strengthened his resolve. He began to see himself not just as a survivor, but as a catalyst for change. For Garrett Huxley, the once confident officer at the center of the case, the world looked very different. His resignation from the police force had been swift and unceremonious, a quiet admission of defeat buried beneath layers of procedural bureaucracy. There were no headlines marking his departure, no statements of remorse or vindication. Garrett's uniform now hung unused in his closet, a relic of the life he had once lived, a life that had revolved around authority, power, and an unwavering belief in his own righteousness. In the days following the trial, Garrett found himself adrift. His colleagues, once his allies, had grown distant. The camaraderie he had taken for granted evaporated, leaving him isolated and uncertain. For the first time, Garrett was forced to confront not only the consequences of his actions, but also the deeply ingrained biases and behaviors that had led him to this point. He felt a gnawing emptiness, a sense of loss that he couldn't articulate, and he struggled to find a way forward. One day, a chance encounter with an old friend led Garrett to a community center that worked with at-risk youth. Reluctantly, Garrett agreed to help out, though he was skeptical of his ability to make a difference. At first, his presence was met with suspicion. The young people at the center knew who he was and what he had done. But as the weeks turned into months, Garrett began to listen to their stories, their struggles, and their hopes. Slowly, the walls began to come down, both theirs and his. For Garrett, the experience was not a redemption arc but the beginning of an uncharted path, one that forced him to confront the humanity he had ignored for so long. Malcolm, meanwhile, returned to the courtroom the following week, his demeanor as composed and steady as ever. Yet something had shifted. The trial had sparked something in the community, a movement that could not be ignored. The courthouse, once a place of routine judgments and quiet bureaucracy, became a focal point for change. Malcolm found his docket filled with new cases brought forward by people who, inspired by Jordan's courage, had decided to speak up. The stories were as diverse as the people telling them, yet they shared common threads: injustice, marginalization, and a yearning to be heard. Malcolm approached each case with the same careful deliberation he always had, but now his rulings carried a different weight. They were not just judgments. They were statements, signals to the community that accountability mattered and that justice was a principle to be upheld, not a privilege to be bestowed. Jordan's life took a new trajectory in the months that followed. The experience of the trial had left an indelible mark on him, shaping his sense of purpose. He enrolled in college, determined to study law, not out of admiration for the system, but out of a deep desire to change it. Malcolm, ever the steady presence, continued his work with quiet determination, his chambers filled with letters, some expressing gratitude, others frustration, and still others hope. One letter in particular stood out, a note from Jordan, written in careful, deliberate handwriting. It was short but heartfelt, thanking Malcolm for his fairness and for giving him a platform to be heard. Malcolm read the letter several times, each word resonating deeply. He folded it neatly and placed it in his desk drawer, a small but powerful reminder of why he did what he did. As time passed, the ripples of the trial spread further. Policies were revisited, practices scrutinized, and conversations about justice grew louder. It wasn't a revolution, but it was a beginning, an evolution of thought and action. For every step forward, there were obstacles, but the momentum was undeniable. Malcolm watched these changes unfold with cautious optimism. He knew that progress was slow and often met with resistance, but he also knew that moments like the trial were stepping stones towards something greater. Now, as the story reaches its conclusion, I ask you to reflect on what it means to seek justice, to hold ourselves and others accountable. This story wasn't about heroes or villains. It was about people, flawed and complex, navigating a world that often fails to see them as they are. It was about the courage to speak out, the humility to listen, and the strength to change. What would you have done in their shoes? How can we, as a society, move forward to ensure that justice is not just an ideal but a reality? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Let's continue this conversation together. If this story resonated with you, if it made you think, feel, or see the world a little differently, let us know. Join where stories challenge, inspire, and celebrate the power of humanity. If this story moved you, don't just keep it to yourself. Like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe for more narratives that dive deep into the heart of the human experience. Your support helps us continue this journey of exploring what it truly means to be human. Thank you for being part of our story. See you in the next one.